Welcome to the Engaging Culture podcast presented by Bridgeway Christian Church. I'm Brian Kiley, Bridgeway's Director of Connections and Communications. On this episode, my co-host, Bridgeway Senior Pastor Lance Hahn, and I are joined by our worship pastor, Jake Owen.
What up?
We will be talking about how movies, music, and television have influenced us. Oftentimes, these art forms are simply entertainment. However, they can also have a major impact on how we see the world, how we understand God, and how we live. We'll talk about how our faith can affect the way we engage with arts and entertainment, and how the arts can affect the way we think about God. We'll also share some of our favorite movies, musicians, and television shows, and how they've made a difference in our lives. All of that and more on this episode of Engaging Culture. All right. Well, welcome to Engaging Culture. All three of us have lost our minds.
Was I not supposed
Less than 30 seconds into the episode.
I not supposed to say
I haven't
anything?
laughed that hard in a long time. Oh my gosh.
Has
What?
never been on
A podcast, apparently.
I've never
or
been
anything.
in front of a microphone ever. I don't know the
right.
proper etiquette at all.
So Jake was unaware that he's not supposed to interrupt the guy doing the intro. But that's
Right.
all right. Hey, well, I am joined by Lance Hahn. Lance, how's it going?
It's going wonderful. I'm in a very good mood now. That was hilarious.
That
actually
was hilarious.
hilarious.
I can feel tears on my cheeks. I'm
Oh
laughing
my
very
gosh.
hard.
Good stuff.
Jake,
Yeah.
we are joined by you as well. You made a little introduction of yourself earlier.
Well,
but,
I like to enter a room properly.
Yeah.
well,
When I
You've
hear
never done one, but
when I
that's
hear
all right.
my name, I always respond with a "What up?"
What
yeah.
up? Yeah.
Yeah.
Very
any
professional.
of you that go to Bridgeway do that in the middle of church. It really throws things off.
Yes.
So, anyway,
Excellent.
but Jake, glad that you are with us. Looking
Hey.
forward to our conversation today. So for those of you listening, we've had two pretty heavy episodes back to back. We had Kurt Lewis on talking about the refugee situation in the world. We had Alex Weiss on to talk about immigration and kind of what life is like for undocumented immigrants. There's a lot going on in the world this week that could make for another very heavy episode. Obviously, we just finished with one hurricane. There's another one threatening. There was an announcement this morning about DACA. And this is even, okay, I read an article this morning of Vladimir Putin kind of telling everybody to calm down about North Korea stuff.
Yes.
When Vladimir Putin is telling people to calm down, you know that
Things are bad.
things are not going great. So
No.
there's all that. So we could obviously talk about all that. We are going to have a little bit of a lighter episode today, only because even in the midst of all the crazy stuff going on in the world, we know that it's helpful to take a step back and sometimes it can be helpful to focus on other things for a little bit. But just because this isn't about a pressing current event doesn't mean this isn't an important conversation. We're going to talk about movies, music, television. These are major cultural influences. Nearly everyone engages with these forms of entertainment in some way. There's virtually
sir.
nobody in Western culture who would say, I never watch movies, never listen to music, and don't own a television. You don't see that very often. And yet, the way we engage varies widely from person to person. The shows we watch, the movies we watch, how much, how little, all of that. There is a huge amount of diversity from person to person. And for the purposes of our show today, as Christ followers, I think it's worth asking the question, how does our faith influence in a wide range of ways the way that we engage with these forms of media? And then also, how have these forms of media just influenced our lives and influenced the way that we think about God? So, first question that we'll go to you, Lance, and then Jake, is just talk about the role that these different forms of media play in your day-to-day life. Movies, music, TV, stuff like that. Talk a little bit about the role that they play.
Yeah, I guess I'm a huge believer in the power of media. And I'm talking
sure.
about the arts, I'm talking about creativity, I'm talking about all that stuff. And I'm going to say this phrase hopefully multiple times during the podcast because there is one thing that I would love to impart out to people and have them think like me in this regard. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't really care. I just want everyone to think like me in this regard. And so this is the deal. Whoever runs Hollywood runs the world. Whoever runs Hollywood runs the world. Now, here's why I am talking about that. It is such a massive influence. A couple weird stories. I believe that even as back in the day when Barack Obama was going to become president of the United States. The first time he went huge was a backup by Oprah Winfrey. The minute Oprah backed him, his name went everywhere. Like in a moment, it took somebody and who very well could have been absolutely 100% qualified and done all these other things on their own. It just changed the game.
Yeah.
Yep.
The other thing is that we all know about this whole thing about fake media and everybody yelling about that and all these different things. It's changing the world. So here's the other funny thing. I was just in Uganda, right? And I talked with one of the pastors over there, and he's scared to come to America. And I said, why? He said, I don't want to get shot. And I said, well, why would you get shot? He said, because that's what's in every communication that comes from America. So all the movies and everything, it literally influences the East. It influences everything in the world, whether it's from fashion or it's from everything. So I believe that not only, I always joke that I was raised by Hollywood. I was raised by Hollywood and a single mom, which couldn't be more opposite, just to tell you. My mom hated movies. She hated all that stuff. That was not her thing. My dad, fully in. It was our way to bond, everything like that. So to me, creative arts, media, movies, music was everything to me and still continues to influence me very strongly.
Oh, yeah.
Very cool.
That's actually really interesting. I guess what struck a chord with what you just said was that that's something that I've always known but never really thought about until you just said it, because you think about how like Hollywood, in a lot of ways, and we're not just talking about movies or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of different forms of media, but like what we say, what we dress, what's appropriate, what we engage with, what is acceptable, either on a small scale or like a large scale, most of that conversation worldwide comes out of what is happening in terms of art or what the movement at that moment. So there's a lot of power in that, and I don't really know how to deal with that entirely, but that's pretty interesting.
And I want to hear from you about how it influences your life personally, but even just something to add in, it tells us who the enemies are.
Right.
So, for example, I grew up in an era where our enemy was Russia, and all the movies, the bad guys were Russia. So you can always know an era by just watch the movies, and it will tell you who it is. And all of a sudden it changes over, and then it's this person. Then it changes over, and it's terrorism, and it changes over. Really, media will tell you. Now, you have all the enemies existing. It highlights which one we're now going to focus on.
Right.
And it can bend the entire world situation because we're all the ones voting for the most powerful nation in the world. And we're influenced by movies.
And you're even seeing things like, and I know that we weren't going to go deep and we don't necessarily have to, but even like political movements and stuff are all sort of moving and flowing around what is the conversation, which starts in that place. So, interesting.
What about for you personally?
So my role and my job is to primarily engage people through music. So I'm just going to talk about that piece real quick. But because my job is to engage people through music, I am constantly having to sort of walk the line of like, what are people engaging with? And it's a really interesting thing because we're talking about, for my role as a worship leader, we're talking about the heart of God, but the vehicle is the art piece. So it's like I have to be aware of what the art piece is to communicate the heart, you know? So it's interesting. I'm constantly like, what are people doing? What are they listening to? Why is this important right now? Why is this not important right now? What happened to that? Where is this going? I know that's kind of vague, but like I'm always sort of listening and wrestling with what's the most appropriate way to push people forward. Because in a lot of ways, art can push and shift people more and influence people more than most things. And so if that's part of my role is to use an art piece, I'm always like, well, how do we use that in a way that's honoring, but also that's grabbing people's attention? It's very strange. It's a very strange job.
It is strange. And if you're not paying attention to the art, if you're not paying attention to that element of culture, then really you're not paying attention to the culture. And ministry is going to be very difficult. Relating to people is going to be very difficult.
Yeah, you're right. And it's always shifting. It is always changing. And Lance, I'm sure even for you, like in terms of like content or things that you say or things that we're passionate about or things that we're like, we're going to go after this. Like, I don't know how much that influences you, but as the shepherd, there's got to be some amount of like being aware of all of that stuff and taking some of that into consideration.
I think the word I think the word that you use, conversation, is huge, because whatever the conversation is in society, that you end up usually addressing. And the media is both a reflection of culture and a driver of culture.
Wow.
And so in some ways, if you want to know a culture, look at their arts. It'll tell you something and it'll reflect what's really going on. Well, at the same time, influencers utilizing it actually drive it into new places.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's a reflection, sometimes it's a driver.
Yeah.
And I got to know what that is, so that if I'm talking to people and relating Christ to today, if I'm relating, I need to know what is the acceptable conversation. What currently are we allowed to talk about? What are we not allowed to talk about? What is interesting? What is not interesting?
Right. I think something else that is interesting in this day and age as well is because there is so much diversity in media, you can't count on everybody having the same experience. So I was trying to just even now on my computer look up a quote from a book that talks about this phenomenon, and I can't find it. But the idea was that back in the 70s or 80s, when there were only a handful of networks, only a handful of programs, the top-rated shows were watched by a pretty high percentage of the populace. So as a preacher, as a musician, what you can make as a public figure, you can make reference to particular shows knowing that a large portion of your audience knows what you're talking about. Whereas now there's so much diversity. There's 1,000 channels. There's infinite YouTube channels and everything else. We're getting our entertainment and our media from so many different sources that even the top-rated programs are being only watched by a small percentage of people. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic, because there is this need to pay attention to the media in terms of art, but then also there's such diversity that there's always going to be aspects that we're pretty ignorant of, which is a difficult tension.
Well, let me put some pieces to that. So back in the day when there was only ABC, NBC, and CBS, there was 3, 10, and 13. Those were pretty much, unless you watch Channel 6.
Dude, PBS.
Just saying.
Or Channel 31 and Channel 40.
No, they weren't there around yet.
Oh, okay.
Come on, youngin'.
I'm younger
What's wrong
than Lance.
with you?
I had all those channels.
Or
Okay.
if you're not from
Lance-
Sacramento, these channels don't mean anything.
Yes, absolutely. So ABC, CBS, and NBC, those were pretty much the three. Well, even if you start going back further, when you had very limited options, when Archie Bunker was around. So All in the Family is the name of that show. And it was full of racial tension. It was breaking new ground. It was creating, it has this whole bigot character. It was like crazy. Well, if you watch TV, you probably knew of that show because there weren't many options.
Right.
Nowadays, like for example, if you're flying through cable, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
Endless.
So if the Logo channel, which tends to lean, and be very driven towards the LGBTQ community, if they do something that's shocking, a huge portion of the whole world has no idea.
Right.
But when Archie Bunker's show or that All in the Family show was shocking, people had to dialogue around the water cooler about it because it was one of your few options. So in one sense, it's been diluted by options, but in another sense, crazy things that wouldn't get attention can rise up and take over.
Yeah, when you said that talk around the water cooler, which by the way feels like the most ancient of phrases.
It is.
Yeah. But I know we've kind of talked about this before, but I think that is what is one of the most interesting things, is that's the power that it has.
That's right.
Art brings and we just said that, but art brings the conversation like to life, and people will have like these massive conversations about something that either could be a small thing or a large thing, but something that stemmed from an art piece. Like art has this crazy power to engage you with either something that we haven't thought about yet or something that we're all thinking about, but it just has this way of bringing it to the surface with all of us. You know what I mean? Like it brings it out.
Okay, so another example. Right now, I bet you anything, Jake, you have no idea what the latest speeches from Trump have been.
0% idea.
Okay, 0%. There was a day back in the day, if we're going way old school, it was Abraham Lincoln and these guys. There wasn't a lot of arts and everything. There was some minstrel shows and stuff like that. But in general, things got communicated out from the President of the United States. It was kind of like you'd all pay attention.
Right.
Every time stuff like the State of the Union comes on, anyone under a certain demographic does not care. They do not listen to it. They do not have any idea what the President of the United States thinks. But they know what Kim Kardashian thinks. All of a sudden, you have a no-name person who has risen up and become world dominant as far as social media, and they're asking questions and answering questions for the world situation, and you don't know what the most powerful person in the world thinks, but you do know what celebrities think.
That's true. And also, the president will, he answers their questions.
Yes.
That's the interesting thing, too.
It is a backlash.
The conversation is, the number one guy is having a conversation with this entire movement of people that are coming out of, that cult, that community, which is crazy. That's crazy that's where the conversation is.
Yep. He has to respond back into those influential cultural pieces.
It's changed a lot, it feels like.
It has. And I want to get to talking about movies here in a second, but an interesting point to all of this is you look at, okay, you have the president, the most powerful person in the world, which obviously his social media use is very controversial, but there's really no denying the fact that it's effective. Throughout his campaign, it was effective.
Yep.
Now, in terms of mobilizing his base, it's effective. He uses Twitter and people pay attention.
Yes.
So on the one hand, you've got somebody in a traditional power position, the president of the United States, leveraging social media. His predecessor before him leveraged the media and the arts very well, President Obama, and that was a large part of his success. But then on the other hand, you've got people who, I guess no disrespect meant to the Kardashian family, but they had not really accomplished much before they became internet famous. And now they've got incredible amounts of influence because they have developed this sort of social media following. So on the one hand, there's still a hierarchy, just like there was back in the day, but the hierarchy is different now, and it doesn't eliminate these traditional positions of power, because like we just said, the president uses social media, but it opens up opportunities for influence that simply did not exist 20, 30, 40 years ago. If you wanted to be influential back then, you had to get in the door at a media company and make something great, whereas now you can make something great, hey, like from right here in this studio.
Hey.
Yeah, all by yourself. I was looking through in preparation for this. I thought it was I was kind of looking through and saying, what does the world think are influential films? So I was going through lists. On almost every list was the Blair Witch Project.
What?
Incredibly lame movie, right? It was a horror movie.
Oh, I
Here's
remember.
why
It
it was
scared me.
influential. It was made for $24,000.
Right.
And it was made with handheld cameras that non-professionals could have, and it grossed millions and millions of dollars. And the reason why it was a game changer is it shifted it out of only the huge companies can do it,
and
it took it into the hands of the people, changed the game.
That, even in the the music industry, the exact same thing is happening.
Yes.
You used to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars,
millions of dollars,
a ridiculous amount of money to make professional albums. And over the years, we've seen something that was once for the elite or whatever now is in the hands of the many, and people, some of the most influential, even music artists, are the ones who did stuff on a very small budget, or who did it themselves. It's just really, it's very cool.
We were watching the Video Music Awards the other day, which, boy, not only did it make me feel old, but I immediately went, wow, I'm depressed. So anyway, I was watching it with my kids, and my wife goes, who's that guy? And he was a super good-looking young guy. And the girls go, that's Shawn Mendes. And Shawn Mendes is a singer. And she goes, oh, where'd that guy come from? They go, he's a YouTuber. And once again, it had nothing to do with big companies. This guy is on the largest stage for Video Music Awards. And you go back to Justin Bieber.
Yep.
He's a world-known name.
Yep.
but he was found on YouTube.
Yep.
And you can keep playing these games and going, oh my gosh, that person over here, they were just doing this.
Yep. I am I think I'm a millennial.
Yeah.
Yes,
you are.
You are.
Which I feel like I shouldn't be because I feel like I have an old soul. But either way, I am obsessed with YouTube. I love YouTube. And the thing is about like YouTube in particular, what once was just like random, I put a video up of my kid's soccer game or something, has now turned into average people who just make things like this, and we're watching like there's a show I watch that has 11 million subscribers. Two average guys who just bought a camera and had something to say and now have a massive following.
Yeah, you're talking about millions of people. Yeah. Do you guys know in Journey, right? The band Journey.
Oh, yeah.
We're going old school, right? Well, and for a local people that listen to the podcast around here, of course, Lincoln Brewster, he played guitar for Journey. And so a lot of people are connected into this. Well, of course, their singer. The singer of Journey today was seen as a copy band on YouTube by Journey. They found him. Wow. I believe he's Filipino.
I know this
dude.
story.
He is absolutely phenomenal. Well, once again, he was doing a cover band, saw him on a video, called him up, and he's the new lead singer of Journey.
I think it's incredible. On the one hand, there's all these potential points of entry. So anybody can get in the game, so to speak. On the one hand, that means there's more competition than there's ever been, because now instead of competing for contracts or things like that, we're competing for eyeballs, essentially.
Absolutely.
Hey, there are a million things you can watch on YouTube. Why should you watch my thing? But what's exciting about that is it really is a meritocracy in the sense of if you can do great work, set up your camera and do some great work.
Right.
Sit and talk with your buddies, and if you've got interesting stuff to say, it's going to do well. Play your song. Do what you want to do, and it's no longer... The gatekeeping power is not what it used to be.
There is there's a lot of talk about, and again, I follow a few of these different people, and there's this one guy that I follow, and he said people will buy into a good story over a good product now, and that wasn't the case once upon a time. Like people just wanted the nice thing, but he's like people will support a great story if you have a great story. However you get it out is the secondary thing. Yeah. It's the good story that people buy into.
Tom's shoes.
A great example.
It's not the product.
People are into the narrative.
It's not the product. And in fact...
It's the story behind the product.
Exactly, because the product itself actually, it was kind of a new style, but like I had some and they fell apart almost instantly.
And it was not the quality.
But I bought them because of the story.
Yes.
And I wonder...
that's a millennial thing as well.
Yeah, what was
there
one of
I
my
go again.
A big takeaway? So a while ago, I read this book called Creativity Inc. by one of the founders of Pixar, and one of my big takeaways from the book was in Pixar world, which obviously they've made incredible films with incredible messages, and their use of digital animation is fantastic. At the core of everything they do, they say, is the story. If the story stinks, we don't have anything. If we no matter how well you dress it up, if you don't have a great story, you don't have a great movie. And I love the simplicity but difficulty of that. On the one hand, it's not about all this extra stuff. It's not even about, you talk about the Tom shoes example, it's not even about the quality of the shoes, it's about the story. But if you don't have a story, you don't have anything. And it's true in movies, it's true in everything. That element is still there. There's something in us, and I would suggest it's something placed in there by God, that a great story compels us. And now, in this day and age, there's just lots of opportunity for us to be exposed to great stories, and for those who are content creators to create great stories, which is exciting.
Random Pixar trivia.
Oh, yes.
Toy Story, first movie ever created totally by computers. That was a Pixar thing, and that was a game changer. Go ahead. You were going to say something valuable.
I was, probably. But now I don't remember.
Well, now you don't remember.
All I'm thinking about is Buzz Lightyear.
Buzz Lightyear.
All right, well, let's we're talking about stories. Let's talk about movies for a little bit.
Yes.
So quick answers to this question, and then we'll ask a better one. So scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're practically ready to start your own movie review blog, and 1 being you would need directions to your nearest movie theater. You don't even know where it is. How much of a movie person are you? Scale of 1 to 10. Go.
Oh, I would probably say that I am 7.
7. Okay.
9.
Lance, you're
Yeah,
a 9.
I was gonna guess that you were pretty high.
9.
I know you love movies.
Oh, yeah, I'm huge into movies.
Yeah.
And I am not anti-movie. I just don't watch a lot of movies. So I would say I'm about a 2.
Okay, but let me ask you this question though. Like a lot of the movies that I watch, I would put myself, like I said, about a 7. But I love like Netflix indie films. I love, like, I'll see big Hollywood productions, but not nearly as often as I'll see the, random, these 2 directors made this movie and they did it on the cheap budget and it's got the, like, because I'm so drawn to those kinds of stories. I think you're like, go to the movie theater, buy the popcorn,
Yes.
have the full
And
experience.
there's a reason for that. So you and I have different motivations for why we go see movies. And so I absolutely see all the blockbusters. Usually when a list comes out, right, you were joking that a list came out and you're like, I didn't even know half of those. Whenever they release things and they go, oh, the Academy Awards are coming up or whatever, the Oscars, and they list it. I already have seen them all. I already know what they all are because I see movies for connection.
Say more about that. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and it'll go into a lot of the other stuff that we'll talk about. But for me, it's all about dialoguing with other people. It's a connecting element. So I see a movie. So, for example, I just took the other night, my daughter, I wanted to just encourage her. She was having a rough time. So I grabbed my oldest daughter, and we went to go see a movie. Well, she hadn't seen the latest Spider-Man, Spider-Man Homecoming. And so I had already seen it twice in the theater. I went and took her again because I wanted to create a bonding connection with her, and I knew that other friends of hers would have talked about Spider-Man because there's a teen element to it. So I think of movies in terms of connections and communications and telling stories. I even highlight out in the movies, one of the things that I was going to talk about a little bit later is that not only the deep part of it is that it was my huge connection with my dad and my whole family, but in a funny way, 1975. Now, you got to remember, I was 3 or whatever, 4. I was pretty young. But Monty Python launched The Holy Grail.
Yes.
Now, The Holy Grail was the first movie growing up that was it was a connective movie. Because when you watch the movie, it's boring. When you talk about it with your friends, it's hilarious.
Like Napoleon Dynamite.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And what happens is, the Holy Grail, no one goes back and just watches it by themselves. They all talk about it. It's a connection piece. So if I say, we're the knights that say, and then somebody immediately knows what the knights say, right? That's what they say. Now, I can sit there and do anything, any line, and someone's going to finish it. That makes you and I bonded over an experience.
Anyone listening to this is thinking of like 20 different Monty Python lines.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, later in 1980, the movie that I ended up memorizing was Airplane.
Oh,
so Airplane
so
is another movie where we would do a line and somebody else would do the other line, and it was connective. So everything with me about movies is power of influence and opening my eyes, and the other half was all connection.
2 things. One, I just saw Airplane for the first time like 6 months ago.
Oh my gosh. Welcome to the universe.
Hello, world.
Me who's a 2 on movies. I've seen that like 1,000 times.
Yeah,
so great.
I didn't think it was great. I didn't think it was great. I appreciated that people think it's great.
It's only great when you talk about it with your friends.
Okay, that's probably it. But you know what? On a similar note, last year I was talking to my wife and I was like, we should watch The Goonies. And she was like, oh, I've never seen it. And that was an Airplane moment for me where I was like, what do you mean you haven't seen The Goonies? It's the greatest movie of all time, which isn't true, but I was shocked. I was completely shocked. What I was going to say though is you talked about the connection piece, and I was just going to say that's interesting to me, and that actually knowing you, that totally makes sense. That totally makes sense. And I would say, like, when I watch movies, I am watching that is probably like at the bottom of my list. I'm watching movies that usually I'm drawn to, like movies that are like dramas or things like that, or serious movies, because I'm drawn to movies that have this like story, and it doesn't even always have to resolve, like something that like addresses issues that I love those kinds of movies that make me like cry or make me think about something. I've watched movies and just like been in like lost in thought, and so it's entirely.
I got a list of those right here.
Entirely different.
Okay, so let me just say for a moment about the connection piece and why it's so personal to me. So my dad's mom, we referred to her as Nana back in the day, and I didn't know her very much. She was Hungarian. She spoke Hungarian, but she was of the era where movies were first coming out, right? Mm-hmm. So it went to the silent movies and then stuff like that. Well, she loved movies, and that was her connection with her son. They didn't have a whole lot in common. Mm-hmm. So my dad grew up completely obsessed with movies. To this day, if you go on my family side of things, all we do is when we hang out and talk, we immediately start by talking about movies. And we all go, did you see this? Did you see this? What about this part? How did it move you? All this stuff. It's the way that we bring depth into the conversations around us is all around movies. Mm-hmm. So that's another reason why I go and see them.
That is cool.
So that's interesting. So we're talking about movies, so I'm going to make this a very brief caveat or a brief tangent. But everything that, Lance, you have said so far about movies, I would say about sports. Like that is
no question.
Huge. It's been a huge bonding thing for my dad. For my dad and I. I know, Jake, you're a huge sports fan.
Love
right?
it.
Love sports. The sports is your favorite thing.
Go sports teams.
No,
not his favorite thing.
It's not his favorite thing.
But whether it's live things I've gone to with my dad, whether it's things like my dad and I talk a lot more during basketball season because we have 10 Kings games or so that we drive out to. We sit together the whole time and drive back. So just by nature, we talk about it more. And whether it's when we get together for family dinner, whether it's sports we've watched on TV, whether it's we play some sports together and talking about that sort of stuff, there is this huge connective component. I'm carrying that on now with my own kids, that it's something for us to bond over. And I think that there's a lot of power in that, whether it's movies, music, sports, whatever, all of these different cultural influences, all of these different ways of entertaining ourselves. It's entertaining on its own. I love a great sporting event sitting by myself. But what makes it even better is even this Sunday night, watching a crazy football game and texting with all my buddies about what was going on, or getting my kids out of bed to watch this big, exciting finish.
Right.
That's so much richer. In the same way you talk about watching a movie with your daughter. You think about maybe being at a concert with someone you love and having that memory of, man, remember that time we saw that band in that place and they played that song. It's powerful.
Yeah. Sports, arts, and entertainment, they're all that way. We can talk about Woodstock. It's interesting because you go, that was this era. Well, what was it? It was all wrapped around music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing that I got to throw out a caveat. I should have put this warning up front, but we're going to be talking about movies. And whenever you talk about me and movies, I've seen everything. Now, here's the problem. I'm also a pastor. And so people get a little weirded out about the whole thing so I need to mention, we're going to be talking about movies and different things, and you want, not necessarily knowing which era I saw it in or stuff like that. You got to be careful on the rated R stuff, right? So that's a rated R, right. That's rated R, that's rated R. I'm going to be talking about movies in terms of influence or meaning or things like that, as opposed to authorizing movies of going, that's a good idea for your spirit.
Right.
So
well said.
I do believe that, and one of the things I hope that we camp on, at least at the end, is the reason why I'm so fascinated by the creative arts is because they're so influential. They can be used by the kingdom of God for such powerful reasons. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about up front, obviously, can be good and bad, right?
Sure.
So I just want to put out the caveat of going, you guys, I'm going to say stuff that you're going to go, oh, man, if I watch that movie and I think that Pastor Lance saw that movie, it's going to twist your head out. Yeah. It's like your dad seeing something, right?
And I think it's important too, just to note that to talk about a movie being great is not the same as endorsing every idea in the movie. Same with television show. Same with, and I guess I'm probably more paranoid about that than I should be, that if, say, someone sees me quoting some person, then all of a sudden that's that is assumed
Yes.
that I'm endorsing everything they've ever said, or if I say I really like this book, it means I agree with every idea in it. And we just need to be clear that that's not the case. And for you now, we'll move into maybe talking about what are some of these movies that have really influenced you. You're saying they're great in a lot of ways. You're not saying,
Yes.
hey, this is a great articulation of my worldview, or hey, this is something that you should watch with your child.
No.
So,
Or it's a good idea for your spirit, the images are right, stuff like that. That's not what I'm talking about. So going back, Jake, to what you were referring to before, I put down a little list that when I get asked what movies were influential to me, they're actually either a whole bunch. I can either name 10,000 or I can name very few, because most movies for me are impactful for the one point they made. It doesn't mean that it influenced my whole life, but it means that whatever point they made was deep for me, and it slightly altered my worldview.
Right.
There are a couple movies where I went, different things changed for me because of that movie, but they're very few. So give you a couple examples. We'll start with a funny one. So the funny things were, my two favorite movies growing up were The Breakfast Club, which was all about teen angst.
Great movie.
Great movie. Nice. And it was just simply being a teenager with teenagers being talked about, and it was realistic, and it moved me. The other one was The Lost Boys. And the only reason why that was a big deal to me is because it's a reason I grew my hair out. There's an actor.
That's Kiefer Sutherland.
Nope. It was an actor in there called Billy Worth. And he was on Kiefer Sutherland's team, and he has all long hair the same, and it's all the same length. I literally was having a party, played that movie, and the girl I liked said, "Oh, he's cute." And I went, "Yes, he is."
I'm never
And you
cutting
also,
my hair
boom,
again.
right there.
You also sharpened your teeth. You filed
Yeah,
them.
as a vampire, just to try
And
to
you're like,
impress.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, so those are the funny ones. All right, so here are some impactful points that along throughout my life. So, for example, movies introduced me to things that I would have never experienced. I may have learned them in history class, but I learned a lot of stuff in history class, and I kind of blew past them. So growing up, my mom was super puritanical. She did not like, it was the 80s era where, media was the devil and music was the devil and all this stuff. Well, my mom was fully saturated in the Hollywood is of the devil. So she hated movies. So I grew up on Sound of Music, Fiddler on the Roof, and stuff like that. But here's what's fascinating to me. Fiddler on the Roof, to me, was the first time I ever engaged with the persecution of the Jews. I don't know if you guys know the story, but it's a Jewish family, and it talks about the clash because they're over in Russia. And so there's a Russian that comes in, and it's the pulling apart of the families, and they in the movie end up getting chased out of their village. I mean, there's really deep, powerful things in there. Now, later on, there was movies like Schindler's List. You cannot watch Schindler's List and not be moved. There's no way that you're not going to understand history better because of that movie. Yeah. So that was an impactful point.
Yeah, I have a huge fascination with war movies, specifically like World War II movies. I am so drawn to them, and I think part of that is there's the historical piece of going like, my goodness, like this
really happened.
This was something so massive and defining, and I wasn't there. But this is like letting me, like it's inviting me into this reality a little bit. I know that's not fair to say, but a little bit. It at least opens up my eyes. And then what was the other part? I don't remember. But that, like, I've always been like drawn to that kind of thing because it's like it's powerful to be able to reach into time or reach into something significant and go, my goodness, if anything, now I can identify a little bit with this. And
or at least get into the conversation. So
100%.
If your grandparents want to talk about Vietnam,
right?
You weren't in Vietnam.
Right.
And I was too young to even understand Vietnam. But all of a sudden I wrote down Platoon, the movie Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
All these movies are Vietnam movies.
Right.
And they let you know about the horrors of war. They let you know about, wow, this is a very complicated situation. Oh, this really must have been a turmoil for our nation. Wow, the Vietnam vets had to go through certain things like this. So I believe that stuff, whether or not they're accurate portrayals or not, they Like anyone that's ever a real, if I see a movie about a drummer or I'm like, that's not real. Or a movie about a preacher, that's not real. But they're not real, but there's elements of them that open your eyes.
Right.
Right. There's a level of connection that it makes possible that really wouldn't be there if not for the film depiction. Even if the film depiction, A, may or may not be 100% accurate, because what really is, and then B, obviously, nobody would ever suggest that sitting and watching a movie about, say, a war is the same as being on the battlefield. But there's a level of empathy and connection that can.
I watched on the flight back from Hawaii this last summer. I watched what was the name of it? It was the movie about the Boston Marathon with Mark Wahlberg.
Patriot Games.
Isn't
that what it's called?
Either way,
I don't know.
I know it came out
though.
recently, and I watched that movie, and I was on the plane like, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. But the reason is like I was transported to this reality, which wasn't that long ago, and I was like filled with like actual sorrow. I was reminded of how in the midst of a big and beautiful world, like there are tragic things that are real and happen, and that did happen. And so it was crazy. I'm sitting here like, this is going to be really embarrassing if you like lose it right now. But it moved me to be pulled back to that place in time.
Patriots Day.
Patriots Day.
I
Sorry.
think the other
Thank
one
you,
is
Patriots Games is Harrison Ford.
Yeah, I was like,
Harrison Ford.
I don't think that's
With
like
Patrick
that's
Ryan
that's
character.
a movie, but I don't think that's the one. But no, I think that's a powerful example, though, Jake. I think you're right.
So a couple more that I was thinking about when I was a super little kid. There was a movie called Kramer versus Kramer, and it was about divorce. And so I'm talking about how some movies handle dysfunction in homes where you never get to talk about them otherwise, but they'll talk about them up on the screen. I think about the racial issues, Boys in the Hood, Fruitvale Station. More recently, 42 with Jackie Robinson.
Right.
Understanding, because I grew up in either the country or suburbia, and I'm a white kid. I did not understand any of this. If it was not for movies bringing me in, then I'm able to dialogue and start and then learn about what things are really like once I was able to establish connections.
Right.
So, I mean, there's things like, if you guys remember Pay It Forward.
Yeah.
That actually launched a national movement of goodwill. Like, hey, pay it forward, pay for somebody's meal behind you, stuff like that. Fight Club. Fight Club was about, people are like, oh, it's about fighting. It was never about fighting.
No,
the whole book and movie was not about fighting. It was about the mundane existence of white middle class. Yeah, and it was talking about not having a connection into the world around you, and so you have to do something to jar you back into it. But as far as if we're going to talk about influential movies, like that literally had an impact on me for a deeper reason or more long-lasting, first time I ever saw The Ten Commandments, the remake, is 1956 movie, right? So I don't know when I saw it, but, I wasn't born until the 70s, so it was a long time before me. But that's Charlton Heston as Moses. And the reason why that impacted me was it was the first visual representation of a Bible movie. So when I would read the Bible stories, I would think in terms of how they pictured it. Now, since then, we've had a million of them.
Sure.
Right.
But that was the first time. It's how some people feel about the Passion of the Christ today.
Yeah.
That they can't think of Christ's crucifixion without thinking of the movie. And that was only released in 2004. Right? But I would probably say that the most influential movie or impactful movie within recent years, and this one came out in 1999. So what year were you born, Jake?
86.
86.
Come on now. You're going to
so
talk
the
about...
year that Jake was born, 1999.
No.
1986.
Yeah.
The Matrix. The Matrix came out. There's been no movie even since that had that many layers that tied into a Christian analogy example for me than The Matrix, which is super ironic because the directors, that was not their main intention. But, I mean, think about it. Real world versus the one that you live in, which we think of a supernatural world, and heaven is more real than the world we live in. Yeah. The rebirth into the real world. When you see him, he's born again. His name is Neo, and he was the one, which Neo is simply the one, and he's the messianic figure, and the Christ figure who is talked about by the oracle, which means the one speaking for God.
Right.
And then Cypher's the betrayer, who's Lucifer. I mean, the whole thing is biblical, all doing different things in the supernatural realm than you could do here. So what happened is that type of movie. Now, modern day would be Lord of the Rings. Modern day would be Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Right? Because they have so many layers where while you're going through your Christian life, you go, oh my gosh, this is kind of like when he said you have a blue pill and a red pill. Which one do you want to take?
Right.
And you can either go this way and live a lie, or you can really understand what's going on. I mean, there's so many. I don't know how many sermons I have created and went, oh my gosh. This is just like, but I can't keep recounting it. It was 1999.
Right.
In my 4,000th, it's the reference to the Matrix.
Yeah.
Here we go.
By
But
the way,
there are a lot.
Top Gun came out the year that I was born.
Wow.
And I think
Maverick.
Terminator or Terminator 2.
That's
So
embarrassing.
That's pretty good stuff.
That's funny. So we just got a great list of movies from Lance that have impacted him, and obviously there's a lot from a lot of those different movies we could unpack. Jake, would love to hear from you a little bit, whether you've got specific titles in mind or even just certain genres that have spoken to you. What has influenced you?
Yeah. So when you asked me this question, I was like, well, because I have a hard time answering what are your favorites in any category. Like it's just hard for me. Mostly because I'm like a very in the moment person. So like whatever is the coolest thing right now to me is like the coolest thing right now to me. And so it's hard for me to answer. But I was thinking like, what are the things that I like have always kept coming back to? And I was looking through even just like my small collection of DVDs. We don't have a ton. Because who needs actual DVDs anymore?
Right.
You know?
What? What's a DVD?
Yeah, right. And I'm looking at movies like Rudy. Movie. Well, yeah, like Rudy and That Thing You Do, which was also 99. What up? But what I noticed was this theme, and I realized that this is true about me. I am and have always been very drawn to stories about like the underdog or the person who was told no that went, but my convictions say yes, and so I'm going to move forward, and I'm going. It's not about the success of the movie. It's about the fight to be who you were made to be,
overcoming.
And that's a constant. I didn't even realize that until I was looking through, trying to like ask myself that question that you just asked me, and it's the story of overcoming. I'm very drawn to the story of overcoming, and I think that applies, as a Christian, but also just like in general, like the story of getting over the hurdles and the things that we face. And I think that's why I keep coming back to these kinds of films.
Right. I mean, those sorts of movies, I think they awaken something great in us, or they make us perhaps look at the possibilities of life in a new lens. When we see those who should not have succeeded go and succeed, it makes us think, okay, where am I? What opportunity is there for me, or what does that awaken in me? Go ahead.
Oh no, and the last thing I was going to say is, and the thing about that too is like I'll watch these movies and I will be deeply moved to a place of worship, like deeply moved to a place of worship. So I'm watching this movie about a football player, but I'm in like on my living room floor, like crying out to the Lord, like thanking Him for like all of like I'm making, but cool. I'm making these connections that weren't in the film, like you talked about The Matrix. These were not obvious connections, well, kind of obvious connections, but there are these things that we then, based on our conviction and based on what we know and based on our first love, are able to go like, oh, I found you there also, Lord. Like I found you there. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's so powerful because I believe God is in all truth.
I agree.
Anywhere you find truth, you're going to find God. And I don't care who said it. I don't care how it was said. I don't care how messed up or how much mud was wrapped around it. If that's God, that's God. And I think that registers and resonates in our spirit.
I totally agree with that, 100%.
Yeah. So my favorite movie of all time is Hoosiers. Have either of you seen Hoosiers?
No.
So, Lance, have
Not
you
only
seen
did
Hoosiers?
I see it, but recently it was on TV, and so I recorded.
I don't
Nice.
even know how, what that word means.
So, it's about a high school in Indiana whose little nothing basketball team goes and wins the state championship. It's based on a true story. It is one of the greatest sports movies ever. It's basically Rudy except basketball.
Yeah.
And I actually, between college and seminary, wrote 3 different papers on the movie Hoosiers. And you talk about, like, don't cry. Like, I cry at the end when they don't mean to spoil it for anyone. They win it all. But there is,
What?
yeah, right.
Those movies never end that way.
I'm with you. Whether it's Rudy, whether it's Miracle, you can come up with, or that movie where Dennis Quaid played that was based on a true story. The teacher who went and made it to the big leagues playing baseball. It's just an unbelievable story. I mean, I love sports, but I love it's so emotive and it's beautiful and it's powerful. And yeah, I remember. I think I may have The Rookie. That's what the movie was called.
Yeah, great movie.
I may have wept during that movie as well.
When he throws the fastball past the speed
limit sign.
sign.
The little,
and it's like 62, and then he walks past and it's like 92 or whatever.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, he did it.
So I have one more movie I want to talk about, and in it bring up sort of a genre that's interesting. So when we were kids, cartoons were cartoons. They had some messages behind them, but they weren't particularly deep. There are certainly themes to older movies, and there's beauty in them even for adults. But I think it's interesting now, sort of starting with Toy Story. I see that not only was it historic in the way that you mentioned and some others, but that was, to me, kind of the first kids movie that was made for adults, right? Like there's lots of layers to that movie. And in many regards, Pixar has continued to do that in creating movies that are maybe geared towards children, but it's not the sort of thing where you're like, well, I'm a grown-up, I guess I'll take my kid to see the movie and I'll just kind of deal with it. You know that you're going to enjoy yourself as well. You think about, I love the Shrek trilogy, for example. But a movie that we saw, my wife and I, we saw it when it came out because I remember my aunt coming to a family dinner and just raving about how great it was. The movie Inside Out. Did you guys see that one?
Of course. I've seen all animated films.
He's seen every film.
I know, stupid question. That movie, to me, was an adult movie with kid visuals.
Yeah, for sure.
That movie spoke to the human condition so powerfully. I don't know that I've ever, this is maybe a ridiculous thing to say, and I don't see a ton of movies, so take this with a grain of salt. I don't know that I've ever been as deeply moved by a movie as I was by that one. It was very powerful.
Yeah. Jake?
Lance?
I thought you were going to say something. No. Just in terms of in that movie, if you haven't seen the movie, you're basically looking inside the mind and heart of a young child going through trauma. And really, it has these emotions that are characters in the story. And it's talking about a world that she had dreams that have been shattered and worlds collapsing.
Yeah.
It's really deep.
I did see the movie, and I think for me, and I actually was just talking to a friend about this 3 or 4 days ago, about how on some level there are just universal themes that no matter whether you're 5 or you're 95, it's true all across the board, and how you the depth to which you connect to it will vary based on perhaps age or based on all of these ways that you process. But the thing about a movie like Inside Out is there are, even though for you it hits you in this really deep and overwhelming way, it could still, because it's a universal thing, it could still hit your children who are much younger and who have a far greater view of the world at this point, and but they're still able to connect with something, because when movies or any kind of art can touch on something that stretches across those kinds of things, we can all be pulled into that place.
Absolutely. And that's part of the power of art, is we can connect with it in these different ways.
Absolutely.
At different levels depending on our age. So every single one of these episodes, we end up leaving thinking about how it went too long, and this one's going to go a little bit long as well.
Shocker.
Oh. Yeah, put microphones in front of us, we keep talking. But I do want us to spend a little while talking about music, because we've spent all this time talking about movies and had a kind of an interesting discussion in general. So looking at music, Jake, we'll start with you, since you're the professional musician here. Talk a little bit, if you can, just about the way that even your maybe even your non-professional engagement with music, your engagement with music as a musician yourself and just as a fan of music, how has that influenced your life, and in particular, how has it influenced your spiritual life, even just music that's not maybe overtly Christian?
So I'm going to back up a little bit. When I first became a believer back in, I was 17 years old. This was before I was a musician. This was before I had any concept of worship or anything, before I was called to that at all. The first thing really, because it was the next day, the first like deep conviction that I had from the Holy Spirit. It was my first time having a deep conviction, was to throw away every single album that I'd ever purchased. I was 17. I'd bought all the, you know what I mean? Like that was the era of going to Tower Records and buying all this stuff. I bought all of those things, and I was asked to throw them all away. Because, and looking back at it now, I can go, oh, I realize now that music has an influence on me big time. And it was sort of like in that moment, the Lord was like wiping the slate clean. He's like, I want to start fresh. So from that point on, it was like my only engagement was anything that was like you could buy at the Family Christian Bookstore. That was the only music I listened to. And over the years, as I was able to mature and stuff like that, other kinds of music found their way back into my playlist. And now my iTunes is filled with tons of different genres of music. I mean, like tons of different genres of music, because I'm a lover of music. Mm-hmm. And when I listen to music, and I don't typically listen to, although it doesn't really have an effect on me anyway, but I don't typically listen to a lot of stuff with a ton of profanity or anything like that anyway. But like when I'm listening to this music, like it's moving my heart, and I'm connecting with it on a level of musicianship, which is a deep part of me. But also, like we just talked about it this last weekend, that music has this ability to like move, like bypass your head and settle into your heart. Yeah. And so I listen to all sorts of music, and I have had, and I know I keep saying this, but it really is true. Like I have had intense worship moments listening to, you know, a song by Coldplay or whatever, something that is not at all, at least intentionally, about the Lord, but I can identify with the overarching story or the overarching cry. And so when I listen to music, I'm listening usually through either the lens of how does this sound, because I love how music sounds, like I'm drawn to that, but also I can connect with it on this sort of heart level. Whether it's saying Jesus 10 times in the song or not, I can still sort of listen and connect with someone who's singing about heartache or a burden or something massive that is like a struggle. Like I can connect with all of those things. So does that answer your question? Like,
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. And even just the music itself, right? Like I find myself drawn to worship sometimes even by instrumental music. I find that if I'm needing inspiration for a writing project or something, that, I mean, I joke that Sigaros is what they play in heaven, you know, like just that sort of a thing is just very,
I think that probably is going to play in heaven.
Right? I mean, it's not that ridiculous when you think about it, right? Lance, how about you? I mean, music's obviously been a huge part of your life. Talk a little bit about it, the way that it's influenced you.
I wrote down these simple phrases. So music changed the course of my life. And it's the reason why I'm a pastor today, and it's the reason why how God built me. So, and that's actually not an exaggeration; it's actually literal. So, music for me is a little bit different because I don't listen to a lot of music these days. Because to me, it's all or nothing for a lot of it. So, like, for example, I drove in listening to music today, and I'm immediately figuring out all the drum parts and everything. So those of you that listen to this podcast that don't know, I grew up, and at 13, I started drumming. And I thought I was going to be a drummer for the rest of my life. I thought I was going to do, Christian music all the way till I was 21, and then everything changed. The reason why I say it made me who I am today and it made me to become a pastor is because God took 3 different pieces of my life, put them together, and made me who I am. One of them was he took Bible knowledge. So I was raised in a Christian home around the Bible. I'm a intellectual guy, so I studied all the time. I was around people that talked about intense stuff about Jesus, and I was at Christian school. So I had so much biblical knowledge, but then it had to be matched with a certain character. You all know my story. I've written a book on panic disorder since I was 6 years old. So I've had a lot of wounds and hurts and changes and everything else that have made me very deep and emotional in different places. So I took a soft heart, a compassionate heart, all these things, and a love for people as to how God built me. The problem was I was missing one thing, because even at that place, I was still very quiet until music. And so the music, when my buddy down the street, not a believer, was into heavy metal. He's the only person I knew, and he got me into heavy metal. So I was into Metallica and all these heavy bands. And my mom, of course, wanted me only in anything that was Christian. And so she would take me to the Christian bookstore, and she said, you can pick out one thing. We didn't have very much money, so she said you could pick out one thing. And I went back there, and I saw a band that had long hair, and it was Stryper.
Oh, yeah.
And it was the only band that had long hair. And you got to remember, this is also the 80s where my school removed me for having a Stryper shirt. So it was not acceptable even in Christianity, but they were a Christian band.
Wow.
And so I said they removed me. I had to go home and change my shirt, is what I'm saying. I'm not allowed to even wear that stuff. I wasn't allowed to wear the shirt under a shirt,
Right.
which was kind of crazy. But anyway, but the point is that when I connected in with that, and at the same time, my sister started dating a guy who became her first husband, who was in a band. They were in my mom's garage. They were the first role models. They were the first adult men that were on fire for Jesus, bold, proud, strong.
Yeah.
And that lit a flame in me. And it took my soft heart, my knowledge, and it put it together with power and boldness. And boom, I exploded out of there from 13, and it just began to build and build and build. And all of a sudden, that's the reason why I do what I do today.
Wasn't like when you would play at, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you would do shows, and you would also, isn't that where you began
Preaching? Yes. So I was in a band, a Christian band, and we had a rule: no preach, no play. And we played speed metal, heavy metal stuff. And we were Christians.
Yep.
And if you wouldn't let us preach the gospel, we wouldn't play the show. And we played bars,
Okay.
clubs. We played everywhere. We played really intense places because that music was acceptable.
Right.
But I would get out of the drum set, and I would go forward, and I preached every concert. And we've toured the United States. So
Wow.
I was all over. I preached in Michigan. I preached in Virginia Beach. I preached in Corpus Christi. I preached in Redondo Beach. I
Right.
preached in Georgia, and all across the United States. So that was way before I ever even started the Bible study or became a pastor.
Wow. You know what's interesting to me too is that had you just walked into one of those places and just began to preach, it would have probably been a much different story to a degree, but
I would have never got in the door.
Probably wouldn't.
There's no way.
But it's interesting how music can be this sort of unifying thing
Yes.
that was in essence a tool that was used to have however many were in that room, whether there were like 5 people or 40 or 400. It was this way for you guys to all sort of go like, oh, here we are, we're together, we're all kind of united in at least this moment. And there's like this softening to the atmosphere that then allowed you to go, and also, which is really cool how music was the tool, and oftentimes music is a tool to because it is this sort of universal language. It's like you can, whether you're here or you're in Asia or whatever, we can all listen to the same piece of music, and without like we speak different languages and stuff like that, but we can all hear the same thing. And that's really crazy how you could be in this setting and you're all sort of like responding to this same moment, the atmosphere shifts, and then you have this ability then to stand up and step into what is in essence the real reason why you were there, which is to go, hey, bring the gospel.
And that takes it full circle for me. And I want to hear more about your musical engagement, but it takes it full circle that I've watched the power of the influence of music and media, even just opening doors and spreading the gospel.
Right.
And that's why I take this kind of stuff seriously, you guys. I don't, we just this last weekend, I don't know when, whenever we air and you're listening to this, maybe at a later podcast, but just before we did this last weekend, I played drums with Jake on the worship team, and we talked about worship. And I believe so strongly in all of this stuff. I support groups that do Christian media. I do, all this makes such a big difference because it is the inroad to be able to share the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right.
Right. It communicates ideas. On the one hand, ideas that maybe would not be as well received through other media, but then also just it allows us to think through these ideas, obviously in a different and a more kind of emotionally evocative, but even intellectually evocative manner, right?
Right.
So, Jake, talk to us a little bit about, I know you said it's hard to pick favorites. I totally I'm with you on that. But if we could just talk a little bit about musical influences, and I'm not necessarily talking about musicians that have influenced your personal musical style, as much as just as a listener of music, maybe some musicians or acts that have been powerful in your own life or that have caused you to think differently about things or just made a difference in some way.
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. Okay, I would say that probably we're talking bands like this is. I mean, you guys are gonna just laugh at me. Here we go. John Mayer. I love John Mayer, and I love John Mayer recently went through a huge life crisis, which I can't identify with at all. His life crisis was about himself, but he wrote this album that was entirely a response to his life crisis.
Is this his newest one?
It's probably a couple albums back now. Okay. He's made a few. But like I'm like, again, it's sort of like these themes that I can go like, oh, I can connect to that, even though you're not talking about the exact same thing. Like I can connect to that. So things like, that album was really great to me. There's, like you said, there's instrumental albums that like don't have any words, but for whatever reason, like my mind can go into a million different places, and often into really like deep and good and powerful places. Yeah. I'm trying to think on the fly. This is such a hard question. Band, Young the Giant. They had their entire band is filled with like the lead singer is Indian American, and then the drummer is like I think like his family is from France, and so like their whole band is filled with essentially like people who are either children of immigrants or they themselves are like the first generation or whatever, and their whole last album dealt with the top, like to an artistic level, their whole album dealt with the topic of like what does it look like to come into a place and find unity and find love and find peace and talk about issues like differences and all these things, and not everything I agree with, but still like I love the album because I'm able to like connect with it on that level and go like, yeah, Lord, like what about that? So and these are not Christian bands. I don't know if people are in these bands have a relationship with the Lord, but I can still listen to that and go like, oh, my heart is moved to then, to a posture where I can go, yeah, what about this, Lord, or whatever. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, no, that's cool.
I will say one last thing too,
ahead,
and just because I constantly I feel like I'm thinking about this, but especially in music, the trend tends to be that about 5 years after something is current, the church will adopt it. And so it's like this constant like behind, like after the fact, now we're like, we caught up, and then the rest of the world has moved on to the new thing. And it's like this constant chasing. And I would love across all forms of art, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I would love to see the church being the people who are on the forefront of people who are made to partner in creativity with the Lord. Like I would love to see the church like move to a place of creating ahead of and creating the trend as opposed to always catching up to the trend.
Absolutely.
I know that wasn't your question at all, but
I mean, I think that's a great point. I feel like that's a whole topic practically for another episode, but it's a great, just the idea of let's not be people that are copying culture, trying to create Christian versions of it, but rather to be ones who are creating it. All right, we are so far over time. If you're still listening, thank you. We're going to end with a fun question.
Oh yeah.
And then we're going to call it a day. So we're talking music. Didn't really get into Lance's influences as much, unfortunately, but got to hear some of Jake. So here's the last question, though, guys. Ready? It's 2 parts. Number 1, first concert you ever attended.
Yeah.
And number 2, and I'll let you choose 2, mostly just because I have 2. Your favorite concert you ever attended. So live music first and favorite. Jake, you look like you're ready.
Okay.
So go.
First concert ever. I was It was the year 1999, which has been a
theme?
a very very important
The
year.
year
for
you
this-
were born. Oh,
the year
okay.
I was born, 1999. I went to the 107.9 The End Jingle Ball
Nice.
concert where they had bands like LFO, Christina Aguilera, like all of the greats.
New Kids
of-
on the Block.
Oh
got
my
a bunch
goodness!
Of hits.
It was incredible. It was life changing. It made me never want to play music ever, and then I did.
Oh, that's
no, that's not
hilarious.
true. But I did go to that, and that was my first concert. I got invited, and then the best concert that I've ever been to, and I've been to a lot. I would probably say, again, not to be redundant, but I saw John Mayer during the Where the Light Is tour, which if you don't know what that is, you should look it up. It's his finest years. I'm just saying. It was such an incredible, and keep in mind, this is strictly on a musical level, just
Right.
But it was incredible. It was so brilliant. I loved everything about that concert. It was outside. What's that outdoor sleep train or whatever?
Amphitheater?
Yeah, they change the name like
They
every
cha-
year.
yeah,
they
I think
do.
it's called the Sleep Train Amphitheater.
Oh,
right
it was.
It changed
so-
again.
It changed.
I think it's a
again.
Bank of America amphitheater now.
Oh, that's way worse.
now.
something
The
like that.
amphitheater up north.
Yep.
Isn't it north? I don't know.
Wheatland. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever. All right, Lance, you go.
First concert was a Christian band called the 77s, I believe, and it was at Warehouse Ministries in the 80s and down in Sacramento. They had a lot of Christian. It was a whole Christian scene, and so I was heavily involved in that. So
Fun fact, the guitarist and lead singer for the 77s played guitar on my first album. When I
Mike
was,
Rowe?
Yes.
No way.
He played every guitar part on that album because I wasn't good enough to play any of the guitar on my own album at that point. So he played everything.
Oh, that is hilarious. We'll
Yeah.
have to talk about that
Yeah.
more. Favorite concerts: Motley Crue and Metallica.
Motley Crue and Metallica.
Motley Crue and Metallica.
Wow.
Two
Where
different-
did
two different
where did
concerts.
okay, where
Multiple
were those?
times.
Okay, wow. Okay, first time seeing Motley Crue. First time seeing Metallica.
Yeah, first time seeing Metallica was at Cal Expo, and it was the And Justice for All tour. And I also saw Rush there. And then Motley Crue I've seen multiple times, but Arco Arena back in the day
Nice.
was, or Echo
Nice.
Arena is
Yeah.
actually what it horrible.
It's a
horrible.
terrible
Arena.
place.
Yes.
That's funny. Okay, so my first concert, Hootie and the Blowfish.
Dude,
Cal Expo. And
I
here's
knew
the
that
funny
was gonna
thing.
come up.
Here's the best part about it is I don't mean to throw my dad under the bus here because he's awesome, but I'm going to do it anyway. Is he and I both I'm sad to admit this. I was in like junior high. I liked Hootie and the Blowfish. My dad liked Hootie and the Blowfish. He did not realize that they were like a his generation band. He thought that younger people were into Hootie and the Blowfish. So he literally told me this afterwards. He said, "We went to that concert. I thought I'd be the youngest person there." Well, or excuse me, he thought he'd be the oldest person there. Well, in fact, I was the youngest person there, and it was mostly people like him. So anyway, but go.
real quick,
Yeah.
I can't stand Hootie and the Blowfish. Like to
You
the point.
shut your mouth.
To the point, I
There's
don't know.
gonna be a
I had
fight.
like a bad experience or something. To the point where, like a few years ago, some friends they kidnapped me on my birthday. Like came in at the middle of the night and they're like, "We're gonna surprise him."
My friends
And
don't do that.
They came in and they were like, "We're gonna do this." And they played. They came in blasting Hootie and the Blowfish, knowing that the sheer sound of that horrible music would wake me up.
That's
Wow.
hilarious.
But I love you, but I don't like Hootie and the Blowfish.
Fair enough. So that was my first one. My two favorites. Number one, Mumford & Sons at the Santa Barbara Bowl, which is an unbelievable venue. Just incredible place to see live music. And this was right, I think they'd not quite come out with their second album yet. So it was pretty early on in there. They just sort of really hit it big. And that was just an unbelievable night of music. And they were so good. And then not long after that, I saw U2 at Angel Stadium. And I mean, what can you say about U2? Obviously, their music is incredible. They put on
What
unbelievable
tour?
shows.
What
The
album?
360-degree one. Now I'm blanking on what the name of the tour was. They had the funky stage that was.
You seen
It
it?
was all.
I didn't see that one.
Oh.
Yeah, but what was the name of the tour? I'm escaping it now, or it escapes me now. But it would have been about 2011 maybe. So,
That's a great answer.
anyway.
Those are really good answers.
Yeah. Like
Nobody
I would,
mentioned
like,
the Soggy Bottom
like,
Boys.
both of those, I would go see them again in a heartbeat. So anyway, all right. Well, hey, there's so much more we could say about all of this, but in our podcast, it's supposed to be 45 minutes. We are now at 1 hour and 13. So thank you, Lance and Jake, for a really fun conversation. This was fantastic. Thanks to you all for listening, joining in on this episode of Engaging Culture. Be sure to watch for our next episode, which will be recorded and released in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Engaging Culture, a podcast by Bridgeway Christian Church. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening. Music is used under the Creative Commons license and is provided by Dexter Britton.